There are moments in your life that split time in half. Not dramatic moments necessarily, not the ones you'd expect. Sometimes it's not a car crash or a death or a diagnosis. Sometimes it's a Sunday afternoon. Sometimes it's a man not looking up from his steak. I need to tell you about one of those moments. Because if you've ever sat at a table with people who were supposed to love you and felt like a stranger, if you've ever given everything you had to people who quietly decided you weren't worth the investment, then what happened to me in that kitchen in Claremont is going to hit you somewhere specific, somewhere you maybe haven't let yourself look at in a while. My name is Blake Thornton. I'm 28 years old. I own a house in Perth, Australia, worth over $1 million, and there was a time, not very long ago, when the people who raised me sat across from me and told me with complete confidence that I would never be able to afford one. This is the story of how they were wrong and how I made sure they knew it. But to understand why that matters, you have to understand what came before. You have to understand what I was before that Sunday lunch. Because the version of me that exists now, the one sitting in a 390-square-foot apartment in Osaka, drinking coffee from a family mart, watching the rental income from a Claremont property hit my account every month, that version of me was built on the wreckage of a different Blake. One who tried so much harder, for so much longer, to be seen by people who had already made up their minds. Let me take you back to the beginning. Claremont is one of those Perth suburbs that carries itself with a particular kind of weight. Old money, old trees, wide streets with Federation houses and double-brick colonials that have been standing since before your grandparents were born. It's the kind of suburb where the houses themselves communicate something about the people who own them, about stability, about legacy, about the assumption that certain families simply belong. My parents had lived in the same house there for nearly 30 years. 4 bedrooms, a backyard that backed onto a quiet reserve, a kitchen that my mother had renovated twice, and a front porch where Dad liked to drink his evening beer and watch the neighborhood walk by like he owned it, which, technically, he did. Growing up in that house, I absorbed the message that home meant permanence. That the Thornton family was the kind of family that had things, kept things, passed things down. Dad ran a construction business that had done well for most of my childhood, not spectacular, but reliable. Mum did bookkeeping for a few local businesses, handled the household accounts, and treated the Claremont house like a monument she was personally responsible for maintaining. We weren't wealthy by any stretch of proper Perth money standards, but we were comfortable. We had the house. We had the car. We had the Sunday lunches that felt mandatory in a way I never fully questioned until it was too late. My brother Mitchell is 3 years older than me. And I want to be careful here because this isn't really a story about Mitchell, not at its core. Mitchell is just a person who received something he probably didn't fully understand the cost of, and who likely tells a very different version of this story in whatever version of it he tells at all. But Mitchell was, for most of my childhood and early adult life, the measuring stick against which I was perpetually found lacking. He went to Curtin, studied business, graduated, got a steady job at an accounting firm in the CBD, bought a new car at 25. He called Mum every Sunday. He remembered birthdays. He showed up to things. He was, by every metric my parents seemed to use, the successful son. And I was the other one. I remember the night Mitchell got his HSC results. He'd done well, not brilliantly, but well enough. And my parents took us all out to dinner at a restaurant in Subiaco that was a step above where we usually ate. Dad ordered a bottle of wine, which was rare, and made a toast. I was 15. I remember sitting across from Mitchell, watching my father look at his eldest son with an expression I'd never seen before, a kind of warm, satisfied pride, the look a man gets when he sees proof that his investment has paid off. I filed that look away somewhere, the way you file away things that confuse and hurt you at 15, and spent the next decade or so quietly trying to earn one like it. 2 years later, when my own results came in, I'd done better than Mitchell. Not marginally better, meaningfully better, in a way that felt significant to me. Higher across 4 subjects. I came home with the notification on my phone, and slightly unsteady with something that might have been excitement, or might have been the anticipation of finally, after years of being the lesser one, having something undeniable to offer. Dad was in the kitchen when I told him. He nodded. He said, "Good. Now figure out what you're going to do with it." And he went back to what he was reading. There was no dinner at Subiaco. No bottle of wine, no toast. I don't tell you that to paint my father as a monster. He wasn't a monster. He was a man with a clear, fixed idea of what a son should look like, and Mitchell had arrived first and settled into that shape, and whatever shape I arrived in didn't quite fit the template he'd already approved. That's not cruelty in the organized sense. It's something more banal, a failure of imagination, a narrowness of expectation, and in some ways that makes it harder to be angry about. You can't really be furious at a man for failing to see beyond what he already believes. But you can spend 28 years slowly understanding that his blindness is not your fault. I'd studied Japanese at university, which Dad considered a hobby, dressed up as a degree. I'd done a semester abroad in Osaka at 22 that I still think about as the most alive I'd ever felt, but I came home because Dad said it was time to get serious. I'd taken a job in marketing for a small company in Fremantle, decent enough work, nothing that made my parents nod with the particular satisfaction that Mitchell's accounting career seemed to produce. I rented a unit in Fremantle, about a 20-minute drive from the family home in Claremont, and for 6 years I moved through a life that felt simultaneously too small and somehow never good enough. Every Sunday I drove to Claremont for lunch. Roast lamb in winter, in barbecue in summer, always the same rotation of dishes, always the same seating arrangement at the same dining table I'd eaten at since I was a kid. I told myself these lunches were important, that family was worth prioritizing, that there was something meaningful in showing up consistently, even when the conversations made me feel like I was slowly evaporating from the inside. There was a particular Sunday, about 18 months into the Fremantle years, when I'd been shortlisted for a position at a larger company, a proper step up, the kind of job that would have meant a significant salary increase, and work I was actually interested in. I brought it up over lunch because it felt like the kind of news you share with your family, the kind of thing that might prompt someone to say they were proud or pleased or glad things were moving. Mitchell asked how much the salary was. When I told him, he said it was about what he'd been earning 2 years earlier at his firm, which he'd since surpassed. He didn't say it unkindly. He said it the way you cite a data point. Dad looked up from his food long enough to say he hoped the company was solid. Mum said she'd make sure to keep Sunday free if I got the job and wanted to celebrate. I didn't get the job, and there was no conversation the following Sunday about how the process had gone, how I was feeling, what my next steps might be. By the following week, it had passed from the family's awareness entirely, in the way that things that didn't happen tend to pass, and we moved on to discussing Mitchell's firm's new software rollout. That's the texture of what those Sunday lunches were. Not dramatic, not overtly cruel, just the accumulation of 1,000 small calibrations that told me, without anyone needing to state it outright, where I sat in the family's emotional geography. The money situation had developed gradually, the way most family financial arrangements do, through small requests that felt reasonable in isolation. When I first moved to Fremantle, Mum said it made more sense for me to pay rent to them than to a stranger. since I was saving to buy my own place eventually anyway. $750 a month, which was slightly below market rate, and which they assured me they were setting aside for when I was ready to get on the property ladder. It felt like a gift. It felt like they were investing in me. I paid that rent for 6 years. Every month, direct deposit, never late. $750 times 72 months is $54,000, though my actual total was 47. Because there were a few months in the early years when I paid less while I was still establishing my income. $47,000, paid faithfully to my parents, money I believed was being held in some form I could eventually access. What I remember most about those monthly transfers is how much I trusted them. I'd watch the money leave my account. Every month, the same amount, the same name on the transfer, and I'd feel something that was adjacent to security, like I was participating in a plan, like somewhere in my parents' finances there was a ledger with my name on it and a growing number next to it, and that one day that number would become a deposit and I'd stand at the door of a property of my own and understand that my family had been building something for me all along. That trust, that specific flavor of hope, is what makes the eventual discovery so precisely painful. It wasn't just the money, it was what the money meant, or what I'd believed it meant. Then came the kitchen renovation. 2 years in, Mum decided the kitchen needed updating. New benchtops, new appliances, something that would bring the house in line with what Claremont kitchens were supposed to look like in the current market. The total cost was around $34,000, which they covered largely through refinancing, but there was a gap, and Mum asked if I could contribute. $8,500, which at the time represented several months of careful saving. I gave it to them because it was the family home, because I'd grown up in that kitchen, because contributing felt like belonging. I remember the day I transferred that money. I was at my desk in the Fremantle unit, laptop open, looking at the transfer confirmation for a moment before I submitted it. $8,500. It took me 7 months to save that amount, working carefully, not spending on things I wanted, making choices every week about what I could and couldn't afford. And I pressed submit without hesitation, because what I was buying, though I couldn't have articulated this at the time, was the feeling of being part of something, of mattering to the structure of the family home. It was a transaction dressed up as love, and I didn't know the difference yet. Then there was Mum's 60th birthday. The family decided she should have a trip to Bali, a week at a resort in Seminyak, massages, nice dinners, the whole thing. Mitchell, who by then was earning significantly more than me, was too busy with a work project to contribute financially. I put in $200. It felt like what you do for your mother's 60th. It felt like love. None of these things felt like what they actually were, which was a systematic pattern of extraction from a person the family had quietly deprioritized. I want to be clear about something. I don't think my parents sat down and calculated any of this. I don't think they drew up a spreadsheet and said, well, we'll take the younger one's money while telling him he'll never amount to anything, because that would be a kind of organized cruelty that requires more self-awareness than they had. What they did was more passive than that, and in some ways more damaging because it had the texture of normalcy. They just assumed. They assumed I would contribute when asked. They assumed my money was available. They assumed my life was something that could be paused or redirected according to what the family needed. And because I kept showing up, kept paying, kept saying yes, they had no reason to revisit those assumptions, but all of that, the rent, the renovation money, the birthday trip, all of that I might have processed eventually. People do. People make peace with imbalanced family dynamics all the time. What I could not make peace with was the Sunday afternoon in the Claremont kitchen when I found out exactly what my name was worth to this family. Specifically, what it was worth in the only language that tells you the truth: legal documents. It was a warm afternoon in late February, the kind of Perth summer day where the air outside sits heavy and still, and everyone retreats to air conditioning by noon. Mitchell had driven up from Rockingham with his girlfriend, Sarah. Mum had made a roast, despite the heat, because Mum always made a roast regardless of the weather, and the dining room smelled of lamb and rosemary and the particular warmth of that house in summer. Dad was at the head of the table as always, sleeves rolled up, already halfway through his first beer. The house that afternoon had the particular sleepiness of summer Sundays. Ceiling fans turning slowly overhead, the yard outside bleached white by heat, the sounds of the suburb at rest filtering through the windows. Mum had set the table with the good placemats, the ones she only brought out for family meals, and there was a jug of water with lemon slices in it that nobody was drinking because everyone was too warm to be genuinely thirsty. Sarah, Mitchell's girlfriend, was telling Mum about a renovation project she and Mitchell had been considering for their place in Rockingham, a deck extension, some landscaping. Mum was engaged, asking questions, nodding with the particular interest she reserved for plans that indicated stability and forward motion. I was listening with one ear, cutting bread from the loaf on the side table, letting the conversation wash past me the way I'd learned to let conversations wash past me at these lunches when they moved into territory that wasn't going to include me. Mitchell had his iPad out. He'd been refinancing his own mortgage recently and had been doing a lot of research on property values, equity, loan structures. He pulled up some documents to show Dad, refinancing paperwork on the Claremont house, which they'd apparently been in the process of finalizing. Dad leaned over to look. Mum craned her neck from the kitchen doorway. They were discussing something about equity release and interest rates, the kind of conversation that, in that house, was always conducted with a certain low-level hum of shared knowledge between Dad, Mum, and Mitchell, a frequency I'd never quite been tuned to. I wasn't paying close attention at first. I was pouring myself a glass of water, half listening, the way you half listen to conversations that have never really been directed at you. But then Mitchell scrolled to a page that showed the property co-owners, and I caught 3 names on the screen from across the table: David Thornton, Helen Thornton, Mitchell Thornton. I set my glass down. I looked again, thinking I'd misread. The light was strange in the dining room in the afternoon, that late summer slant that makes everything look slightly washed out. But no, 3 names, my parents' names, my brother's name, not mine. I'd lived in that house for 22 years. I'd paid $47,000 in rent over the past 6 years, while being told the money was being held for me. I'd contributed to the renovation of the kitchen I was currently standing adjacent to, and my name appeared nowhere on the ownership documents of this property. I stood very still for a moment, the way you stand when something happens that doesn't yet make sense to your body, even though your mind is already starting to process it. My chest felt strange. Not tight exactly, more like something had shifted in it slightly out of alignment. I looked at the document on the screen. Then I looked at my brother, who was scrolling past it to something else, completely unaware that I was even registering what I'd seen. Then I looked at my dad. "Why isn't my name on there?" I said. The table went a little quiet. Mitchell stopped scrolling. Mum appeared more fully in the doorway. Dad looked up from whatever he'd been studying on the iPad, and then, in a movement I will remember for the rest of my life, he looked back down at his steak, just picked up his fork and cut into the meat, and without looking at me, without even the courtesy of eye contact, he said, "You'll never afford a house anyway, Blake. We're investing in someone with actual prospects." 8 words and a sentence. You know what the strange thing is about a moment like that? You'd expect it to be loud. You'd expect the room to tilt, the air to change. The world to rearrange itself audibly around something that severe. But it wasn't like that. The words landed quietly, almost gently in their flatness. Dad took another bite of his steak. Mitchell seemed to be examining something on the iPad screen with great concentration. Mum said something softly about there being more gravy, if anyone wanted it, and the lunch continued. I sat down. I ate. I don't remember what I ate, or whether it tasted like anything. What I remember is the particular quality of that silence. Not an angry silence, not a guilty silence, but the specific silence of a room that has absorbed a statement it intends to treat as unremarkable. Nobody looked at me. Sarah, who had been in the middle of her sentence about the deck extension before my question interrupted it, eventually resumed. The conversation moved back toward Mitchell's renovation plans, toward Dad's views on the timber decking market, toward Mum's opinion on the shade of grey Sarah was considering for the boundary fence. I sat in my chair and watched the lunch continue around me and understood, with a clarity I'd been building toward for years, that I had just heard out loud what this family had believed about me in private for a very long time. The casual delivery was the part that cut deepest. I'd heard versions of that sentiment before, vague implications that Mitchell was the practical one, the driven one, the one with a real plan, but there had always been a degree of deniability in those implications, a way I could tell myself I was being oversensitive. There was no deniability in this. He had said it clearly, without anger or hesitation or even particular emphasis, the way you might say the weather is looking rough or the traffic was bad on the highway. He delivered a verdict on my entire future as an aside between bites. And then, and this is the part that I kept returning to over and over in the weeks that followed, nobody said anything. Mitchell didn't look uncomfortable. Mum didn't gently correct him. Sarah, who was new enough to the family dynamic that she might have been expected to register the strangeness of what had just happened, seemed to have decided very quickly that this wasn't something she needed to comment on. The verdict landed, and the room absorbed it, and the Sunday continued, and the message was not just in what my father had said, but in the utter absence of a single voice in that room willing to push back against it. I drove back to Fremantle that evening with the windows down because the car felt too closed, the air inside it too thick with the residue of that afternoon. Perth in late summer does something specific to the early evening. The heat softens but doesn't fully release, and the drive through the suburbs has that particular quality of suspended time, the world briefly between the day's peak and the relief of night. I took the longer route, the one along the coast road, where you can see the Indian Ocean glittering silver in the last of the light. I don't know why I did that exactly. Maybe I needed the water. Maybe I just needed more time before I arrived home to a space where I'd have to think. I drove slowly past the beach at Cottesloe, where families were packing up the last of their afternoon. A man folding a beach umbrella, 2 kids arguing over an esky, a woman walking a dog through the wet sand at the water's edge. Normal Sunday afternoon. The world completely unaware that somewhere in Claremont, a man had just said something to his son that would change the direction of everything. My apartment was small, 1 bedroom, 2nd floor, a balcony that looked out over a car park, and I sat on my couch with my laptop and pulled up my banking records. Not because I thought I was missing something, but because I needed to see the numbers. I needed the numbers to be real and documented and in front of me rather than rattling around in my chest where they'd been living in some formless, unacknowledged way for years. The $47, $1 in rent. I went through every month, every direct deposit. It was there, clean and consistent, an unbroken record of faithful payment. The $500 for the kitchen renovation. It was there, a single transfer, March of last year. The $200 for Mum's birthday trip. There too. I sat with those numbers for a long time. $58,700. $58,700 that had flowed out of my account and into my family's life, extracted in increments so gradual and so wrapped in the language of family and love and temporary arrangements that I had never once added it up before. $58,700, and my name didn't appear on a single asset document. Not one. I want you to let that number sit for a second, because I need you to feel what I felt that night in Fremantle. Not just the money, though the money was real and significant, but the texture of what that money represented. 6 years of working and paying and contributing and showing up every Sunday and saying yes, and silently swallowing the comparisons to Mitchell and the dismissals and the implications that I was something less than what a son should be. 6 years of that, distilled into $58,700 and an absence from a legal document. And then I did something that I had never truly done before in my adult life. I let myself look at the full cost of staying, not just the money, but everything. The job offer in Singapore 3 years ago. I'd been headhunted by a tech company for a content marketing role, $85,000 base salary, relocation package, a genuine opportunity that made me genuinely excited for about 2 weeks before I turned it down. The reason I told myself I wasn't ready, the reason I told myself when I was being more honest, Mum had said she needed me nearby, that she worried. That family came first. I was 25 years old, and I turned down $85,000 in Singapore because my mother worried. The relationship that had ended the year before. Lauren, who I dated for 14 months and who had eventually, with great patience and evident sadness, told me that she couldn't be with someone whose entire emotional life was organized around trying to win approval from people who seemed constitutionally incapable of giving it. She hadn't said it cruelly. She'd said it like she was naming something that had been in the room with us for the entire relationship, something I kept insisting wasn't there. I'd been upset with her at the time. Sitting on that couch in Fremantle with my bank statements in front of me, I understood that she'd been trying to help me. Lauren had tried to tell me in small ways, long before the final conversation. There was a dinner we'd had with my family, about 4 months into our relationship, a Sunday lunch, naturally, where she'd shared some news about a project she was working on, something she was genuinely excited about. She'd explained it with the particular animation she had when talking about things she cared about, leaning forward slightly, her hands moving. My father had nodded in a way that indicated he'd heard her, but had no further interest in the topic. My mother had pivoted immediately to asking Mitchell something about his firm. Lauren's news sat on the table for approximately 8 seconds before being covered over entirely, as if it had never been offered. I'd watched Lauren's face register this. A small, controlled adjustment. The expression of someone who has just understood something about the room she's in. And I'd done what I always did at those lunches, which was to say nothing, to smooth it over, to make a small joke, to lighten things. On the drive home, she'd asked me if I noticed what had happened. I said that Dad and Mum could be a bit distracted sometimes, that it wasn't personal. She'd looked at me for a moment with a careful expression, and then she'd said, "Okay," and we hadn't talked about it again that night. But she'd seen it, and she'd seen me choose to unsee it. And those 14 months of watching me choose to unsee, was what had eventually worn her out. The conversation when she left was the kind of conversation that feels very quiet while it's happening, but very loud in retrospect. She sat across from me in the Fremantle apartment and said, "I don't think you understand how much of yourself you give away every week trying to earn something that isn't coming." She said it steadily, not crying, with the precision of someone who has thought about how to say something difficult without weaponizing it. "I think you're a genuinely exceptional person, Blake. I think you're capable of things you haven't let yourself try. But I can't watch you drive to Claremont every Sunday and come back less." I'd been upset with her at the time. Sitting on that couch in Fremantle with my bank statements in front of me, I understood that she'd been trying to help me. that she'd been the clearest mirror I'd had in years, and I'd put her down and reached for the Sunday lunches instead. The semester in Osaka when I was 22. I'd spent 4 months in Japan and felt, for the first time in my memory, like I was living inside my own life rather than watching it from a slight remove. I'd come back because Dad said it was time to get serious. I'd been 22 years old. I came back because my father, who had just formalized my brother's co-ownership of the family home while I paid rent into it, told me to get serious. 6 years, 312 Sundays, more or less, of driving to Claremont and sitting at that table and trying to be seen, to be valued, to be invested in, not with money specifically, though that turned out to be the clearest measure, but with regard, with the basic acknowledgement that I was a person with potential rather than a category into which potential didn't fit. 6 years, and a verdict delivered between bites of steak. You know what I realized sitting there that night? There's a particular cruelty in being dismissed by people who know you well. Strangers can't really dismiss you, not in the way that counts. They don't have enough data. They don't know the particular texture of your dreams, the specific shape of what you're reaching for. My father dismissed me from a place of full information. He'd watched me for 28 years. He'd seen what I was capable of, and his conclusion was, nothing worth investing in. That night, I understood something that changed everything. I had been trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided I didn't have one, and in doing so I had spent 6 years not building the life that was actually available to me. I had traded Singapore and Osaka and Lauren and any number of unknown possibilities for Sunday lunches and rent payments and the persistent, exhausting hope that eventually they'd see it. That eventually I'd be enough. The thing is, and this is the part I need you to understand, because it's the part that actually changed my trajectory, sitting there with my bank statements and my list of surrendered opportunities, I didn't feel angry. Not yet. What I felt, underneath everything, was a kind of terrible clarity. The fog had lifted. I could see exactly what I was standing in, and exactly what continuing to stand in it would cost me. I had nothing left to lose. They'd already taken it, and that, strangely, felt like freedom. There was something almost physical about the shift that happened in that apartment on that Tuesday night in Fremantle. I sat there for a long time after I closed the laptop, doing nothing, just letting the understanding settle into my body the way that large truths do. Slowly, in layers, going deeper than you expect. I realized, holding my breath for 6 years, not metaphorically, literally living at reduced volume, taking up carefully calibrated space, spending my emotional energy on a goal that was already impossible rather than on the world that was actually available to me. The realization that it was over, not just the financial arrangement, but the whole architecture of hope I'd built around this family, left me feeling like a room that had been cleared out. Empty, but with a lot more space. You know that moment when you finally say the thing out loud that you've been holding inside for so long, it started to feel like furniture, like something you've just accepted as part of the structure of your life. I called my best mate David on a Tuesday evening, 2 days after the Sunday lunch that changed everything. We met at the Sail and Anchor in Fremantle, a pub I've loved since university. Good beer, old wood, the kind of place where conversations feel real. I ordered a pint, sat down across from David, and just said it. I'm leaving Perth. I'm done trying to earn a place in a family that's already decided I don't deserve one. The moment those words were out of my mouth, something happened in my chest. Something released. It wasn't dramatic. No gasp, no sudden revelation, just this quiet interior shift. Like a pressure I'd been living with for so long, I'd stopped noticing. It had finally stopped. David put down his beer. He's a good friend, David, the kind who knows when to ask questions and when to just let you talk. He asked where I'd go. I told him Japan, Osaka specifically. I told him about the semester I'd spent there at 22, about the Japanese I'd studied at university, about the teaching position I'd seen advertised online for a private language school in the Namba district. I told him I'd already looked it up. I told him the pay wasn't remarkable, but it was livable, and that I spoke enough Japanese to manage in a city that wasn't always easy for foreigners, and that I had some savings, not much, but enough to get started. David asked if I was sure, not doubtfully, just checking. I told him yes. He nodded, took a long drink of his beer and said, "Then go." He said it simply, without qualification, the way a good friend delivers the thing you most need to hear. Then he picked up his glass and said, "I always thought you were wasted at that company anyway." We talked for another 2 hours, about logistics, about what I'd need to sort before leaving, about who would store the furniture I couldn't take. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I became a person with a plan rather than a person with a wound. The distinction matters more than it sounds. That was Tuesday. By Thursday, I'd submitted an application for the Osaka position. By Saturday, I had a response requesting a video interview for the following Monday. By Wednesday of the following week, I had a conditional offer. The salary was $285,000 per month. Not life-changing, but real and mine. They needed someone to start in 5 weeks. I said yes. On the following Sunday, I drove to Claremont one more time. Mum was arranging the table when I arrived, setting out plates for the roast. She was in a good mood, humming something. The house smelling like it always did on Sundays. That particular combination of roasting meat and eucalyptus from the yard, and the faint lavender of Mum's cleaning product. Mitchell was on the back porch with Dad, talking about something to do with his firm's new software system. Everything looked exactly like every other Sunday. Everything felt completely different. I waited until we were all seated. Mum was bringing out the pavlova from the fridge for later, already laid out on the good china plate, the one she only used for family occasions, and I said, without any particular build-up, without asking permission or seeking approval or framing it as a question, "I've accepted a teaching position in Osaka. I'm leaving in 5 weeks." The table went quiet. Mum actually laughed. A short, reflexive sound, the kind that isn't really laughter but is what the body does when it receives something that doesn't compute. She looked at me to check whether I was joking. I looked back at her calmly. Mitchell shook his head slightly, that small signature gesture of his that meant he found something either amusing or misguided. Usually both. "You'll be back in 6 months, he said. Dad didn't respond immediately. He looked at me for a moment. A longer look than I was used to from him, actually, as if he was trying to determine something. Then he returned to his food. "You've thought this through?" he said. Not a question exactly. More like a pro forma challenge. The kind you make when you've already decided the answer doesn't matter. "Yes," I said. He nodded once, in the way that meant conversation closed, and that was that. Mum said she hoped I knew what I was doing. Mitchell offered to give me the name of a guy who did cheap international shipping if I had furniture to send. The pavlova came out after the main, and we ate it and I left. And that was the last Sunday lunch I attended in the Claremont house for a very long time. I want to stop here for a moment because I think it's easy telling this story to make the departure sound cleaner than it was, to make it sound like I walked out of that last Sunday lunch into pure resolution, like a door closing neatly behind me. It wasn't like that. The 5 weeks between that dinner and my flight to Osaka were among the strangest of my life. Simultaneously the most purposeful and the most untethered I'd ever felt. I was packing up an apartment I'd lived in for 4 years. I was selling furniture on Facebook Marketplace. I was closing out bank accounts and redirecting mail and saying goodbye to a city I'd spent my entire life in. And underneath all the practicalities, there was this constant low thrum of something I can only call grief. Not grief for what I was leaving exactly. I'd made peace with the fact that I was leaving something that had already, in the ways that mattered, left me. But grief for the alternate version of my life in which this departure hadn't been necessary. The version where the documents had 4 names on them, where the $47 drone doll had actually been held somewhere, where a father might have looked up from his steak and said something different. That version of my life I was finally accepting had never existed. I was grieving a fiction, but fiction can still ache. I landed at Kansai International Airport on a Tuesday evening in late March. The flight was 13 hours, mostly spent watching movies I don't remember, and refusing to sleep because I knew that if I fell asleep, I might arrive somewhere inside my own head that I wasn't ready to arrive yet. By the time the wheels touched down, I was exhausted in a way that went well below physical tiredness. The airport itself was the first thing. I'd been through Kansai before, at 22, arriving full of the particular excitement of a first international trip. Everything filtered through novelty and youth. Arriving now alone, with 2 checked bags and no return ticket and a conditional job offer on my phone, the place felt entirely different. It felt serious. The immigration officer who processed my entry stamp looked at me with the professional neutrality of someone who processes 100 arrivals a day, stamped my passport without comment, and waved me through. And I stood in the arrivals hall with my 2 bags at my feet and understood that no one in this building or this city had any idea who I was or where I'd come from or what someone in Claremont had said about me over a Sunday roast. The absence of that knowledge was the most extraordinary thing I'd felt in years. I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to, just inside the arrivals hall, letting that absence settle over me like something clean. Osaka in late March is extraordinary. I'd been here before, but at 22 you experience things through a different filter. Everything is heightened by novelty and youth and the particular excitement of being somewhere foreign for the first time. At 28, arriving alone with 2 suitcases and an uncertain future, the city felt different, not less beautiful, more real. My apartment in Umeda was 390 square feet. 7th floor of a building on a narrow street lined with vending machines and a ramen shop that was always open and a convenience store that I would eventually become so familiar with that the staff recognized me without looking up. The apartment had 1 room that functioned as living space, bedroom, and workspace simultaneously, a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in, and a window that overlooked a gap between buildings where you could see, if you positioned yourself just right, a small rectangle of sky. By Perth standards, by the standards of the Claremont house with its 4 bedrooms and its backyard and its front porch, the apartment was tiny. By the standards of where I was emotionally when I arrived, it felt enormous. Nobody in that building had ever told me I'd never amount to anything. Nobody in that city knew my name. I could be, in the most literal possible sense, anyone I was capable of being. That first week, I spent my evenings sitting at the window of the small apartment watching the street below. Osaka at night is a particular kind of beautiful, not the grand, sweeping beauty of a famous skyline, but the accumulated small beauties of a dense living city, the orange glow of the ramen shop, the gentle hiss of a vending machine, a couple walking past with their heads close together, the occasional wail of a distant train. I'd sit there with tea going cold beside me and feel, with an intensity I couldn't quite account for, the strangeness and rightness of being somewhere that had no record of me. Perth knew me as the lesser Thornton, the one who didn't have prospects. Osaka didn't know me at all. In the dark, watching the street from the 7th floor, that anonymity felt like a gift I hadn't known I needed. The first month was hard. I won't dress that up with anything. I started teaching at the language school, a private institution called Namba Language Academy, 5 days after arriving. My classes were a mixture of adult professionals trying to improve for business purposes and university students preparing for examinations. The teaching itself came naturally to me. I'd tutored during university and had always found something genuinely satisfying in the moment when something clicked for a student. The school had a good structure, good materials, supportive colleagues. That part of my life settled relatively quickly. My colleagues at the school were a mix of Japanese teachers and other foreign instructors, a New Zealander named Craig, who'd been there 6 years, and who taught me the unwritten rules of the staff room within my first week, and a Canadian woman named Priya, who had arrived 2 months before me, and who shared my particular brand of bewildered but determined energy. Craig became a kind of unofficial guide to the city's rhythms, where to eat on a budget, which train lines were reliable, what time the supermarket near the station reduced its prepared food prices in the evening. Small knowledge that made an enormous difference. Priya and I ate lunch together most days at a place 2 blocks from the school that did a set meal for Y800, and in those lunches, over rice and miso and whatever the day's fish was, we compared notes on what it meant to have done something large and irreversible and be in the middle of figuring out whether it had been the right call. Priya had left a relationship in Vancouver to come to Japan. She didn't talk about it much, but there was a quiet recognition between us. 2 people who had stepped out of a context that was constraining them and were now in the somewhat disorienting business of discovering who they were without it. One afternoon, a few weeks in, she looked at me over her miso soup and said, "Does it ever feel like you made it up? Like maybe you didn't actually leave and you'll wake up tomorrow in your old apartment doing your old commute?" I told her yes, frequently. She nodded. "Me too. I think that means it was real," she said. And I think she was right. Everything else was lonelier than I'd anticipated. I'd wake at 6:30 a.m. in my small apartment and make instant coffee on the 2-burner stove. And for about the first 30 seconds of consciousness each morning, before memory fully engaged, I'd feel a kind of floating neutrality. Then the situation would reassemble itself. Osaka, alone, 28 years old, starting over. I took the same train to Namba each morning. I bought coffee from the same family mart, a small, creamy can that cost Y120 and that I drank walking the 7 minutes from the station to the school. I taught 5 classes most days, 45 minutes each, with preparation and marking filling the gaps. I came home, made dinner with whatever ingredients I'd picked up from the supermarket near my station, watched something on my laptop, slept. The repetition, which I initially experienced as loneliness, gradually transformed into something I hadn't had a word for before. I'd always associated stability with the Claremont house, with Sunday lunches, with the structures of family life that I'd organized my adult years around, but those structures had been someone else's, and my position within them had been defined by someone else's assessment of my worth. What I was building in Osaka was mine in a way nothing had ever been mine before. The routine was mine. The choices were mine. The bill I paid each month for my tiny apartment was paid by money I'd earned in a foreign city, in a language that wasn't my mother tongue, from a life I'd built with no blueprint and no safety net. By month 2, the loneliness had become manageable. By month 3, something had replaced it. Not happiness exactly, but presence. I was present in my own life in a way I hadn't been in years, maybe ever. The specific moment I understood this was a Wednesday evening in June. I'd finished a particularly satisfying class with a group of 3 businessmen who'd been struggling with presentation English. One of them, a man in his 50s named Yamamoto-san, had managed to deliver a full 2-minute pitch in clear, confident English. Something he'd told me on our first session was the thing he most wanted to achieve. When he finished, his 2 colleagues actually applauded. Yamamoto-san looked at me with an expression that I recognized. the expression of a person who has just proven something to themselves that they weren't sure they believed. I walked home that evening through the Umeda streets in the warm, early summer dark, eating a melon bread from the Family Mart, and somewhere between the third and fourth block, I understood that I was not performing a life. I was living one. The difference was enormous. Month 4, I started private tutoring on weekends. I'd put up a notice on an expat community board and at a couple of international schools, and my first student was a 12-year-old named Haruto, whose parents wanted him to improve his English for a potential international school application. Haruto was quiet and very precise, and teaching him was genuinely enjoyable. I charged Y4, 500 per hour. By month 9, I had 14 regular students. The students were varied in the way that private students always are, a range of ages, needs and personalities that made the work genuinely interesting. There was Mrs. Kimura, a woman in her late 60s, who had always wanted to read English literature in the original, and who I worked with on Jane Austen, one paragraph at a time, with a patience and pleasure that was entirely mutual. There were the Nakamura twins, 12 years old, who competed with each other ferociously during every session, and whose mother sent me end-of-term thank-you notes, written in careful English that she clearly worked hard on. There was Kenji, a 24-year-old software engineer preparing for a job interview at an international tech company, who I worked with for 8 weeks and who got the job and sent me a voice message in which his excitement was entirely audible even through the poor audio quality. Each of these people had chosen to spend their money on me, on my time, my knowledge, my ability to help them with something that mattered to them. They didn't know my father's verdict. They didn't know the Claremont documents. They came to me every week based purely on whether I was useful to them, and week after week I was, and they came back. There is something clarifying about that kind of relationship. It's the cleanest possible feedback loop. You are worth this, as demonstrated by the fact that people keep voluntarily paying you to show up. By the end of the first year, I'd also started saving with a rigidity I'd never managed before. In Perth, my saving had always been interrupted. The rent payments, the renovation contribution, the birthday trip, the subtle and not so subtle ways my money had been made available to things that weren't my own future. In Osaka, there were no interruptions. Nobody called to ask if I could help with something. Nobody assumed my account was accessible. My income was mine in a way it had never quite been mine before, and I found that when you live in a country where nobody expects anything from your money except what you expect of it yourself, saving becomes almost easy. Not painless. I still made choices, still said no to things, still calculated the price of things before buying them. But the energy I'd spent in Perth on managing the gap between what I earned and what the family extracted quietly vanished, and what replaced it was a growing number in a savings account that I checked every month the way you check on something you've planted, watching it get larger, understanding that this was what investment actually looked like when it was invested in you. Let me translate that for you. 14 students at Y4, 500 an hour, tutoring on weekends, typically 12 to 15 hours of sessions per week. That's Y63, 000 to Y67, 500 per week in tutoring income, on top of my Y285, 00 monthly salary from the school. I was making more money than I had at any point in Perth, and I was making it in a country where nobody had invested in me, nobody had believed in me. Nobody had handed me a single thing. This is important, and I want you to feel the weight of it. Every yen I earned in Osaka was pure proof. Not to my parents, they didn't know the details of my finances, but to that voice in my head that had spent 28 years absorbing my father's assessments, that voice that whispered, maybe he's right. Maybe you don't have actual prospects. Every bill paid, every student session completed, every month of rent covered was a direct counter-argument to that voice. Not angry, just factual. You said I couldn't, and here I am. I saved aggressively. I lived simply. My apartment was inexpensive. I ate mostly home-cooked food. I didn't spend on things I didn't need. 18 months after landing in Osaka, I had Y28, 4 million in savings. That's approximately 105 dollars Australian dollars at the exchange rate at the time. Not generational wealth, not even close to the kind of money that gets you a house in Perth outright. But real, substantial, mine in a way that money had never felt mine before. And then one morning, 18 months in, I opened Facebook on my phone over my Family Mart coffee and found a message from my cousin Emma. Emma is my mother's niece, a couple of years older than me, someone I've always gotten along with without being especially close to. She's the kind of person who notices things that other people don't, and who occasionally, when it matters, passes those things along. The message was short, just a link and 3 words. You might want to see this. I opened the link. It was an article from the West Australian, published 2 days prior. The headline referenced a Claremont property being listed for auction, following bank foreclosure proceedings. I read the address, I read it again, then I kept reading. Dad's construction company had collapsed. There'd been a development project in Mandurah, a residential complex, from what the article described, that had gone wrong in several directions simultaneously. Cost overruns, a falling out with a joint venture partner, delays that meant the project missed its sales window. The company had taken on significant debt to try to rescue the project, and when the project failed, the debt came with it. The bank had moved against the assets, and the primary asset was the house in Claremont, the house my name had never appeared on. The house was going to auction. March 15th. Estimated value, $1. 1 million, down slightly from the $2 million figure on the refinancing documents Mitchell had shown everyone 14 months ago. The bank would sell it to whoever made the best offer. Whatever my parents and Mitchell received would go toward debt repayment. The family home, the permanent, legacy-heavy, status-communicating house in Claremont, was going to belong to a stranger in 6 weeks. I read the article 3 times, standing on the street outside Family Mart in the cold March morning air. My coffee had gone lukewarm without my noticing. Around me, Umeda was waking up, the breakfast rush at the ramen shop next to my building, the first trains beginning to move, the particular morning noise of a large Japanese city coming online for the day. I noticed something after the 3rd read-through. Mitchell's name appeared once, in a quote. The family was exploring options. My name didn't appear at all. Of course it didn't. Why would it? I wasn't a co-owner. I wasn't a stakeholder. As far as any legal document was concerned, I had no relationship to that property. The son who'd never afford a house wasn't relevant to proceedings about a house. They probably hadn't even thought to tell me. I stood there for another minute, looking at the article on my phone screen. I thought about the kitchen bench tops. I thought about the Y8, 4 million sitting in my savings account. I thought about a man cutting his steak and not looking up. Then I went back to my apartment and sat at my small desk, and I stayed there for a very long time, not panicking, not strategizing yet, just letting myself feel the complete particular strangeness of this moment. The house my family had told me I'd never afford was going up for sale. The money they'd decided not to invest in me, I had built for myself. These 2 facts were sitting in front of me like pieces of a puzzle that hadn't known they belonged together until now. Then I did the math. Y8, 4 million, approximately $105 Australian. My prepaid tutoring income. I'd been running a semester package for several students, which meant I had a few months of sessions paid up front, representing roughly Y to 600, 000 additional funds available if I chose to liquidate. Then there was the inheritance from my grandmother, which I'd never touched. My grandmother on Mum's side had left me $22,000 when she died 4 years ago, money I'd put in a separate account and never accessed, not out of sentimentality exactly, but out of a vague sense that it should be used for something that counted. I'd always thought of it as property deposit money someday for a house I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to afford. Ironic. I'd need a mortgage for the remainder, but I had income history, stable employment, no debt. The math wasn't comfortable, but it was possible. I went back to my apartment. I sat at the small desk in the corner of my single room, and I looked at the auction date. March 15th. 3 days later, my parents called me for the first time since I'd left Perth. Video call, Dad's phone, his face filling the screen in a way that made him look older than I remembered. Or maybe he'd always looked that old, and I'd just never looked at him clearly enough to see it. Mum was next to him, slightly out of frame. Dad's hands were on the table in front of him, and they were very still in the way hands are still when the person they belong to is working to appear calm. He explained the situation, not apologetically, and my father was not built for apology, but with a flatness that might have been mistaken for stoicism and that I read as shock. The company, the project, the bank, the house. He said it plainly and without embellishment, and I listened without interrupting because the strangeness of this, the fact of him calling me, of him explaining something to me as if my understanding of it mattered, was not lost on me. As he spoke, I watched his face more carefully than I had in years. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. The particular authority he'd always carried, that solid, settled confidence of a man who had built something he trusted, had thinned. He looked like what he was. A man who had bet everything on a project that failed and was now living in the aftermath of that bet. It occurred to me, watching him on that small phone screen in my Osaka apartment, that this was probably the most honest conversation we had ever had. Not because he was being transparent, but because the circumstances had stripped away the version of himself he usually presented. I was seeing the actual man, without the performance of certainty that had defined him my entire life. Mum came more fully into frame at one point, leaning across to speak. She looked worried, in a way that age had made visible. The specific worry of a woman watching something she'd built be dismantled. She said something about the stress of the past few months, the sleeplessness, the meetings with the bank. There was an appeal in her voice that was different from the casual assumption register she usually operated in with me. She wasn't assuming this time. She was asking. She was, I understood, acknowledging, without being able to name it as acknowledgement, that I was a person she needed something from. That was new. It was also, I noticed, 18 months late and several thousand kilometers away from where it might have made a difference. Then he asked if I could send money, maybe $20,000, to cover some legal fees, to buy a bit more time. They were trying to find options. Mitchell had his own mortgage. There wasn't much flexibility. Could I help? I kept my face very still. I'd had a week since Emma's message to think about this moment, to prepare for it, to decide what I would say. I looked at my father on the screen, diminished somehow, in a way that went beyond the poor video quality. The certainty he'd always worn like a second skin had gone somewhere. He was asking me for help. There's a version of me, the version who drove to Claremont every Sunday for 6 years and paid rent into a house he'd never owned, who would have said yes immediately. Who would have felt the familiar pull of wanting to be useful, to be needed, to finally be the one who stepped up, who would have told himself it was the right thing to do and tried to believe it. I knew that version of myself very well. I'd spent most of my adult life being him, but I wasn't him anymore. I had spent 18 months in Osaka becoming someone else, and that someone had done the math, both the financial math and the other kind. I asked if they'd tried to sell the house before the foreclosure. He said they had, but the market had been uncooperative and the timeline was short. I asked what they'd do after the auction. Mum said something about renting somewhere in Mandurah, smaller, more manageable. I told them I'd think about it. Then I ended the call. I didn't send $20,000. I sent an email to my bank in Perth instead. What followed were 3 weeks that I will describe carefully because the sequence matters. But before the sequence, I want to tell you what happened the morning after the call. I woke at 5 a.m. in my Osaka apartment with the particular alertness of a person whose sleeping brain has been running calculations the waking brain wasn't ready to make yet. I lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling, listening to the building wake up around me, the early trains starting, the ramen shop below beginning its prep, the vending machines cycling through their cooling hum in the street. Then I got up, made coffee, and sat at my desk. I pulled up a blank document, and for the next 2 hours, I wrote down every number, every date, every decision I'd need to make in the next 3 weeks, not because I was certain of the outcome, because I needed to see whether certainty was possible at all, and the only way to know that was to look at the numbers without flinching. The numbers, it turned out, were possible. Tight, genuinely tight in a way that left no margin for error and required everything to go right. But possible. By the time I'd finished my second coffee, I had a plan. And the plan was this: I was going to bid on the Claremont house, and if I won, I was going to own it. And if my father heard my name announced by an auctioneer in the city, he'd told me I'd never make it in, then whatever happened next was whatever happened next. First, I spoke to my Perth bank about a mortgage. This required pulling together documentation of my Osaka income, pay stubs from the school, records of my tutoring income, tax filings. My banking history in Perth was clean. I'd maintained the account throughout my time in Japan, and the regular transfers I'd made to it meant it had a good activity record. The mortgage approval process for a remote buyer, especially one with foreign income, was more complicated than standard, but not impossible. It took 2 weeks and significant documentation and more than a few phone calls at uncomfortable hours, given the time zone difference. Second, I registered to bid at the auction. The auction house handling the sale had a remote bidding option, increasingly common for high-value Perth property given how many Australians live abroad and still want to participate in the local market. I set up the account. I deposited the required registration funds. Third, I liquidated what I needed to liquidate. Savings. The prepaid tutoring income, which my students graciously allowed me to access in a lump sum against future sessions, I promised to deliver via video call if I needed to redirect funds. My grandmother's 22 Zozon dollars, which I finally allowed myself to use for the thing it had always been sitting there for, even if I hadn't understood that until now. The night before the auction, I was in my Osaka apartment. It was 10 p.m. Japan time, which meant 7 a.m. Perth time. The auction was scheduled for 8 a.m. I'd been awake since 5, which is unusual for me, but sleep hadn't been a realistic option. I made coffee. I sat at my desk. I had the auction platform open on my laptop and my phone, both logged in, both confirmed as functioning. I'd tested the remote bid interface 3 times over the past week. I looked around my apartment. 390 square feet. The small stove with its 2 burners, the window overlooking the gap between buildings, the desk that was also my dining table, the bed in the corner, a life built entirely from scratch in a foreign country because someone who was supposed to believe in me had decided casually that I wasn't worth investing in. I thought about the last time I'd been in the Claremont house. The kitchen benchtops, the ones we'd renovated together with my $8, $500, the dining table where the documents had been shown, where the verdict had been delivered, the front porch where Dad drank his evening beer and looked at the neighborhood like he owned it, which he had, past tense. I thought about Mitchell. "You'll be back in 6 months," he'd said. With that particular casual certainty, that family-wide certainty about the shape of the possible where I was concerned. I thought about him saying it, about how easy it had been for him, about how little room it had left in his imagination for what might actually happen If the lesser Thornton got on a plane and stopped trying to be something for people who had already decided what he was. I thought about Lauren, about what she'd said the night she left. I think you're capable of things you haven't let yourself try. I thought about Yamamoto-san's face when he finished his 2-minute pitch. I thought about Mrs. Kimura reading Jane Austen in the original, slowly and carefully, her finger moving beneath each line. I thought about the first morning I woke up in this apartment and understood, in some pre-verbal way, before the day's thoughts had assembled themselves, that the life I was waking up to was mine in a way no life had ever been mine before. The auction platform showed the property details: Claremont, the address, the estimated value. Below it, a countdown to the auction's start time. I watched the minutes tick down with something that wasn't quite anxiety, more like the feeling you get at the edge of something you've decided to step off. Not fear of the fall, something more alert than that. I wondered if my parents knew I'd registered to bid. I wondered if the auction house had sent any notification, or if their process made that unlikely. I thought about my father sitting somewhere tonight, the rental property they'd been in for weeks now, wherever it was, and whether he was thinking about the auction tomorrow. Whether the house still felt like his in the way it always had. Whether the certainty had fully dissolved yet, or whether some portion of it was still there, insisting that things would resolve in a way that made sense, given his understanding of how the world worked. I opened a new tab. I went to the Google Street View of the Claremont address. I looked at the house from the street, that familiar blue front door, the Federation brickwork, the garden with the old jacaranda at the corner that dropped purple flowers onto the path every spring, a neighbor's car in the adjacent driveway, the street empty and bleached by the camera's capture of a summer afternoon. I looked at it for a while. Then I closed the tab and went back to the auction platform. At 11 p.m. I opened the bidding platform. The auction was live. I won't pretend I knew what would happen. I had a maximum figure in mind, a number at which I would stop bidding regardless of outcome. Not because I didn't want the house, but because the house was not worth losing my financial foundation over, and whatever I was doing, I was not going to undo 18 months of careful building by overextending myself on an act of spite. This was not spite, or not only spite, it was something more deliberate than that. The bidding was live, and I watched it from my desk in Umeda, with my coffee going cold for the second time in as many weeks. And when the auctioneer called for final offers, I submitted mine. 1,7,500. I sat very still for the duration of the time it took for the system to confirm. Then I got up, stood at my window, looked at the small rectangle of city sky I could see between buildings, and felt something move through me that I still don't quite have language for. Not triumph exactly, more like completion, like a sentence that had started 28 years ago, or 6 years ago, or 14 months ago at a Sunday lunch, had finally reached its period. My phone started ringing about 20 minutes after the auction closed. Emma first, a text, actually, not a call, keeping the international charges down as always. I don't believe it. Are you serious, Blake? Are you serious? Then my phone, the Australian number that Mum still called sometimes, though rarely, ringing 4 times in quick succession. I watched it ring. I let it go to voicemail. I was already booking a flight back to Perth. Emma told me what had happened at the auction. She'd been there. She hadn't known why she was going, she said, just that something told her she should be there. She described it in a long voice note sent after the fact, her voice doing that thing it does when she's trying to be factual about something that is actually extraordinary. Slightly careful, slightly breathless. She said my parents had been there. Of course they had. They had the legal right to attend, and presumably a desperate hope that the auction would somehow resolve differently than it was always going to resolve. Mitchell was with them. They'd stood near the back of the gathered group, my father with his arms crossed the way he stands when he's uncomfortable, my mother holding her handbag with both hands. Emma described the room for me. the auction house's meeting space, which she said was plain and functional in the way these places tend to be. Rows of chairs, a lectern at the front, a large screen showing property details, and the running bid figure. There were maybe 30 people in attendance, some in suits, a few in the casual confidence of people who did this regularly. The kind of crowd that treated a $1 million auction as a professional routine rather than an extraordinary event. My parents, she said, looked very much like people for whom this was not a professional routine. The bidding had moved through its stages. Emma said the auctioneer had been professional and brisk, the way auction houses always are, announcing bids with a kind of procedural neutrality that makes large amounts of money sound almost boring. The figure had climbed toward $1 million, past it, into the territory where the remaining bidders were seriously committed. And then the remote bid came in. Emma said there was a brief pause when the auctioneer acknowledged the remote bid, the kind of pause that happens when something slightly unexpected enters a process everyone was watching closely. She said she saw my father's head turn toward the auctioneer, toward the display showing the bid. She said she saw the moment when the auctioneer announced the buyer's name, Blake Thornton. She said my mother made a sound, not a word, a sound, the particular involuntary sound that a person makes when something they can't process reaches them before the part of their brain that manages composure can engage. She said Mitchell went very still. She said my father stood for a moment looking at the screen with an expression she struggled to describe. Not anger, she said, not quite shock in the conventional sense, but something she'd only ever seen on a face once or twice before. The expression of a person receiving definitive proof that a belief they'd organized their world around was incorrect. She said Dad had to sit down. She said it exactly like that, without additional commentary, because no additional commentary was necessary. The man who had delivered a verdict on my financial future between bites of Sunday roast, the man who had looked me in the eye and told me I would never afford a house, had to sit down when he heard my name attached to the highest bid on the house he'd lost. Mum called my phone 4 times in 20 minutes. I was already packing a bag. I landed in Perth 11 days later. I'd needed to arrange coverage for my classes, settle a few things in Osaka, do this in a way that didn't compromise the life I'd built. I called ahead to confirm that I'd give my parents 3 hours to collect their belongings from the house on a Tuesday morning. The call was brief and factual. I told them the time. I told them they were welcome to use a hired van. I said there was no hurry for the furniture if they needed an extra day for the larger pieces. My father said, "Please," a word I had, genuinely, never heard him direct at me before in my memory. I drove to Claremont from the hotel where I was staying in Subiaco. Perth in autumn is beautiful in the way it's easy to forget if you've been away. The light is different from summer, softer, and the old suburbs look particularly well in it, the gardens and the wide streets and the Federation brickwork. I turned onto the street where I'd grown up and drove slowly past the houses I'd known my whole life, the neighbors whose dogs I recognized and whose gardens I'd watched change over decades. The removal van was outside. Mum was directing 2 young guys from the moving company, pointing at boxes on the porch. Mitchell was carrying something bulky from the backyard. A barbecue, it looked like. Dad was standing at the edge of the porch, looking at the street. And when he saw my car, he didn't move. Just watched me park and get out. I walked up to the house, my house, and the strangeness of that landed differently than I'd expected. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just real. The garden was as it had always been. The front door was the same blue it had been since I was a kid. The porch where Dad had drunk his evening beers for 30 years was exactly as I remembered it. I met their eyes. My mother looked like she hadn't been sleeping well. Mitchell looked like he was trying to read the room and finding it difficult. My father looked like a man who had been certain about something important and had discovered he was wrong and who had not yet fully organized himself around that discovery. We went inside. The kitchen, the one with the bench tops I'd contributed $8, 500 to, was partly dismantled, pots and dishes in boxes, the walls looking bare where small things had hung for years. I stood in it and looked at it, and for a moment the room was crowded with all the Sundays I'd sat at the adjacent table, trying to be enough for the people who'd lived here. Dad asked how I'd done it. He asked it simply, without the inflection that would have made it challenging, which surprised me. Just genuine, plain bewilderment. How had I done it, I told him. The teaching at the language school, the private tutoring, 14 students, Y4, 500 per hour, weekends, the 18 months of disciplined saving in a country where nobody had ever told me I'd fail. The mortgage I'd arranged through my Perth bank, supported by documented income and a clean financial history. The inheritance from Grandma I'd finally put to use. He listened. He nodded. He didn't say anything. I noticed, as I told him, that I felt none of the things I'd imagined I might feel in this moment. I'd spent some time over the past several weeks wondering whether I'd be angry, whether the words would come out with heat, whether I'd want him to understand not just what I'd done, but what his words had cost me. But standing in that dismantled kitchen, telling my father the mechanics of how his son had built something without him, I felt something much quieter than anger. I felt clear, precise, like a person reading from a document rather than opening a wound. The story I was telling him was simply the story of what had happened, and it was sufficient on its own. It didn't need emotion to make it land. The facts were loud enough. His silence wasn't the silence of disinterest. I want to be honest about this. It was a different kind of silence, the silence of a man who is computing something that challenges a deeply held assumption, who is doing the private work of revision that he cannot quite manage to do out loud. I watched him listen to the story of how I'd built something from nothing in a foreign country by myself, and I watched his face do the work of absorbing it. There was no apology in his expression, there was no admission of error, but there was, and I noticed it with something that wasn't quite satisfaction, more like a kind of final understanding, the unmistakable look of a man who had been wrong and knew it. Mum asked if I was moving back to Perth now. She asked it with a specific hopefulness that I recognized, the same hopefulness she'd applied to questions about whether I was seeing anyone or when I might settle down. Questions that were really about whether the family arrangement might reassemble itself into something familiar. I said no. I was staying in Osaka. The house would be rented. I'd found a family already, a young couple with 2 kids who'd be moving in within the month. The rental income would cover the mortgage and leave a margin. Mitchell was leaning against the doorframe of the kitchen, arms crossed, listening to this. He had a look on his face that I couldn't fully read, something between assessment and something else. He asked why I'd bought the house at all if I wasn't going to live in it. He said it without particular malice, which was what made it the perfect question, because it was the question I'd been asking myself for weeks. The question I'd been waiting to answer out loud, the question that was actually the entire point. I looked at him, I looked at my father, and I said, I didn't buy this house to live in it. I bought it to prove that you were wrong about me, and now I have. The kitchen went quiet, the kind of quiet that has mass to it, that presses against the walls. Dad had no response. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. Whatever answer he'd been preparing for, some practical explanation about the property investment, some version of this that made financial sense and didn't carry this particular weight, he hadn't prepared for the true answer, because the true answer was that this wasn't really about the house. It had never been about the house. The house was just the clearest possible language in which to say something that needed to be said. Mitchell looked at the floor. Mum touched the kitchen counter, the new bench top, and then pulled her hand back. I said it without anger. That's the part I want to be clear about. By the time I said those words, the anger had been processed and metabolized into something quieter and more durable. What I felt saying, it was not the hot satisfaction of revenge. It was something cooler and more permanent, the specific peace that comes from being fully understood, finally, in a language clear enough that misinterpretation becomes impossible. They finished packing in silence. The van left around noon. Dad shook my hand at the door. A strange, formal gesture that felt like the first honest interaction we'd had in years, precisely because it acknowledged the reality of what had happened rather than trying to paper over it. Mum hugged me briefly. Mitchell carried the barbecue out and put it in his car without saying goodbye. I stood on the porch after the van pulled away and looked at the street for a while. I noticed things I hadn't registered when I was growing up here, or hadn't let myself register. The particular quality of the afternoon light on the jacaranda at the corner, the way the garden smelled after a Perth autumn morning, the sound the old gate made when the wind moved it. These were just details, but they were the details of a place that was, now, in every legal and actual sense, mine. Not because I'd been handed it, not because someone had decided I was worth the investment, because I had built something real from nothing, and then used it to claim this. Then I went inside and walked through the empty rooms. 4 bedrooms, echoing now without furniture. The kitchen with its good bench tops. The backyard, the garden still tidy. The front porch, where the afternoon light was coming in, at the angle I'd known my whole life. I stayed in Perth for another 2 days, handling the final paperwork and meeting with a property management company who would oversee the rental. The property manager, a composed woman named Diane, who had been managing Claremont properties for 15 years, walked me through the house with a clipboard and the professional appraisal of someone who sees houses as assets rather than histories. She noted the quality of the renovation, the condition of the garden, the school catchment. Good bones, she said, a phrase that property people use, meaning the house is structurally sound, but which landed with a different weight in my ears. Good bones. Yes. I walked through Claremont on those afternoons, and Fremantle where I'd rented for years, and down by the Swan River where Perth does that thing it does in autumn, the light on the water impossibly clear. I ate fish and chips sitting on a bench in Cottesloe and watched a family of pelicans conduct themselves with great dignity on a nearby post. It felt like saying goodbye to something, though I wasn't sure exactly what. The city, maybe, or the particular version of myself that had lived here, the one who drove to Claremont every Sunday and paid rent into a house he'd never owned and waited to be seen. I thought about who that Blake had been, and whether I was angry at him. I'd spent some months being angry. In the way you're angry at yourself when you understand that you were complicit in your own diminishment, that your yeses and your monthly deposits and your surrendered opportunities were not just things done to you, but things you participated in. But sitting there in Cottesloe with my fish and chips, I found the anger had mostly resolved into something more gentle. That Blake had been trying. He'd been doing what made sense to him, given what he'd been taught about where he stood. And his trying, his faithful, misguided, expensive trying, had eventually produced the crisis that made everything else possible. Without 6 years of Sunday lunches and mounting evidence of what was happening to him, there would have been no reckoning, no flight to Osaka, no auction bid. The before Blake and the after Blake were connected. One had made the other possible. That version of me had served his purpose. He'd done something extraordinary in his surrender. He'd showed me, through the accumulation of his losses, exactly what the life I actually wanted looked like. It looked like Osaka. It looked like a 390-square-foot apartment, where nobody had any expectations of me, except the ones I placed on myself. I flew back to Osaka on a Thursday. The life I came back to was superficially identical to the life I'd left. The same apartment, The same family mart, the same train to number, the same 5 classes, the same walk back in the evening with whatever groceries I'd picked up for dinner. The same 14 tutoring students, some of whom I'd arranged temporary video sessions with during my absence and who were pleased to have me back in person. But it was different in the way that matters, which is on the inside. Every month on the 15th, the rental income from the Claremont house hits my account. A family with 2 young children lives there now. A couple who chose Claremont specifically for the school district, who brought their own furniture and who seem, from the occasional communication through the property manager, to be making the house into the home they wanted it to be. They're very happy there. I'm glad. The income covers the mortgage and leaves $400 per month in margin, which isn't a significant figure, but represents something beyond the financial. It represents the self-sustaining nature of this particular proof. I don't need to do anything to maintain it. The house earns what it needs to earn. I live my life in Osaka, doing what I do, and the equation balances every month on its own. My parents live in Mandura now, in a rental on a quieter street, well removed from the Claremont world they'd built their sense of themselves around. We exchange messages on birthdays, a brief text, a photo occasionally from Mum. The relationship is cordial and distant, which I've come to understand is actually the truest form of what it always was. When it was warm, it was because I was working hard to make it warm, feeding it with my money and my Sundays and my surrendered opportunities. Without that input, it settles to its natural temperature, which is polite and remote. That clarity is its own kind of gift. Mitchell bought a townhouse in Rockingham. Emma tells me he's doing fine. I wish him that genuinely. And me. My apartment in Umeda is still 390 square feet. My coffee is still Y120 from Family Mart. I still take the same train to Number, still have my 5 classes and my tutoring students on weekends. I'm thinking about getting certified for more advanced teaching qualifications, which would open some doors. I've started learning to cook Japanese food properly, not just the basics I picked up in the first year. I've started running, not for any particular goal, just through the early morning streets of Umeda before the city fully wakes, past the vending machines and the shuttered ramen shop and the neighborhood shrine that sits at the corner of the street, 3 blocks from my building, silent and composed in the grey light. I have made, in this city, genuine friendships. Craig and Priya and a handful of others who know me only as the person I am here, which is to say the person I actually am, with no legacy of other people's assessments layered over me like sediment. Small things, patient things, the building of a life that is genuinely mine. I own a house in Perth worth $1 million that I will probably never live in again. The property manager sends updates quarterly, and sometimes I read them in my small apartment in Umeda. Notes about the garden, the gutters cleaned, a small repair to the back fence, and I feel something I can only describe as a quiet satisfaction that has nothing to do with distance or convenience, and everything to do with the fact that this particular piece of property exists in the world with my name on it, legally, permanently, in a document that nobody can scroll past on an iPad and edit me out of. People who hear about it sometimes say something like, "Isn't that a waste, to own a house you never live in?" And I understand the question. It's a reasonable question in a world where housing is scarce and property is supposed to mean something beyond symbolism. But here's what I know that those people don't quite have the context to understand. The peace that comes from that monthly rental income doesn't come from the money. It comes from what the money represents. Every time I see that transfer hit my account, I'm reminded of a man not looking up from his steak and saying 8 words that were meant to define me. I am reminded that those words had an expiration date, and that I was the one who decided when they expired. I'm reminded that the son who would never afford a house now owns the one his parents lost, That's not wasteful. That's the most expensive peace of mind I've ever bought. And I am here to tell you, at 28 years old, living in a 390-square-foot apartment in Umeda with my Family Mart coffee and my quiet morning runs and my tutoring students and my monthly reminder that I built something real from nothing, in a foreign country, in a language that wasn't my first. After someone who should have known better told me I never would, I would buy it again at twice the price. Here's what I've learned, and I share this not as someone who has it all figured out, but as someone who paid a very specific price for a very specific clarity. Research on family dynamics and adult children consistently shows that parental favoritism, the open, explicit kind that involves legal documents and casual dismissals at Sunday lunches, has measurable long-term effects on the unfavored child. Not just emotionally, but practically. Studies tracking adult siblings in households where one child was clearly prioritized show that the deprioritized child frequently internalizes that assessment, adjusting their ambitions and opportunities downward to match the family's evaluation of their worth. Not because the evaluation is accurate, because when the people who first teach you what you are worth tell you the number lodges somewhere deep and does its quiet work. What doesn't get measured as often is what happens when a person leaves that environment entirely, when they remove themselves from the atmosphere in which the assessment was made and begin operating under different conditions. Because it turns out that human potential is remarkably responsive to the expectations that surround it. In an environment that expects failure, many people find ways to fail. In an environment that simply doesn't know you, that has no pre-existing verdict about your capabilities, many people find ways to surprise themselves. I'm not an extraordinary person. I want to be clear about that. I'm a 28-year-old English teacher in Osaka who saved money and took a risk and got fortunate in a few important ways, including the good fortune of having a cousin who sent me a Facebook link at the right moment. What's extraordinary isn't me. What's extraordinary is what became possible when I removed myself from the story that had been told about me and started telling a different one. The different story didn't require me to be a different person. It just required me to be the same person in a different place, operating without the constant gravitational pull of someone else's certainty about my limits. There is something I want to say specifically to the people watching this who are still in the middle of it. Not the people who have already left and are processing from the other side, but the ones who are still showing up every Sunday, still paying into a dynamic that doesn't acknowledge their worth, still holding on to the hope that this time, finally, someone will look up. I know you. I was you for 6 years, and what I want to tell you is something I wish someone had said to me clearly and without softening. The approval you're looking for is not coming, not because you don't deserve it, you do, but because the person you're trying to earn it from has already made their decision. And decisions made from the kind of comfortable certainty my father had are almost never revised from the inside. They are only revised by external evidence that cannot be ignored, and you cannot manufacture that evidence while you're still inside the arrangement. You have to leave first. You have to build the proof in a place where there is room to build it. And then if you want, you can bring it back, or you can simply keep it for yourself. The proof was never really for them anyway. It was always for you. I know that advice is not easy to act on. I know there are finances and family pressures and the very human fear of the void that exists on the other side of a decision like this. I know the Sundays can feel necessary in a way that's hard to explain to people who haven't sat at that particular table, but I also know what it feels like to stop. And I can tell you, with the certainty of someone who has been on both sides, the void on the other side of that door is not as empty as you fear. It is actually, if you look at it clearly, a great deal of available space. Space that is yours to fill, on your terms, with evidence of your own making. If there is anyone watching this who has been told, clearly or quietly, legally or casually, that they are not the one worth investing in, I am not going to tell you to go buy your parents' house. That's a specific set of circumstances that came together in a specific way. What I will tell you is this. The assessment someone makes of your potential from inside their own limited understanding of who you are is not a fact about you. It's a fact about them. And you don't have to live inside their fact. You can leave. You can build. You can let the proof speak for itself, quietly and permanently, one unremarkable day at a time. If this story hit something true for you, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people find this channel, and more people finding this channel means more stories like this one finding their way to someone who needed to hear them tonight. Drop something in the comments. Tell me if you've ever been the one written out of the family story, or if you know someone who was. I want to hear from you. And if you're not subscribed yet, please do. Every story we put out, we put everything into it. And there's a lot more coming. Tell me where in the world you're watching this from and what time it is there. Is it 2 a.m. and you can't sleep? Is it morning coffee? Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. And when you finish watching this one, the video on screen right now is waiting for you. I'll just say this. Compared to what Blake went through, the story in that video involves a betrayal that started even earlier and ran even deeper. And the moment of reckoning, when it finally comes, is one you will absolutely not see coming. Don't let it start without you.